One of the most iconic aircraft of the Second World War has to be the B-17. While its impact in the Pacific was a little underwhelming, in Europe it was a key factor towards ending the war. The effectiveness of bombing campaigns from all sides has been hotly contested. Regardless, these campaigns tied up much needed anti-aircraft and experienced fighter units that could have been utilised elsewhere. In this alone on the Western Front, the bomber crews helped to bring the war to a close sooner than it would have otherwise been. The US Bomber Force owes much to Billy Mitchell. He had seen aircraft develop from a curiosity into something both useful and terrifying. He became convinced that no future war could be won without a strong air presence. This, however, was not a popular view of the day, and America, like the UK, had strong naval traditions, and air power seemed to be in conflict with that. This did not improve after he sunk a captured German naval vessel. Aviation technology moved at a truly staggering pace. When we look at aircraft from between the wars, they can appear cumbersome and not really that advanced. But if you consider it was only 20 years from 1914 to 1934, then the advances are amazing. Speed, size, and the biplanes were being replaced by metal monoplanes. One of these newer designs was the Boeing B-9. Taking flight in 1931, it was a twin-engine bomber. While some elements were not revolutionary, like the open gunner positions and cockpit, the retractable landing gear, however, was a very modern feature, even though the idea dated back to 1911 on amphibious craft. Bomber development was hindered in this period by a lack of funding. The Navy was sure that any threat to the US would be dealt with at sea. The B-9 was in service for a handful of years before being replaced by the Martin B-10. While not the most attractive aircraft, the B-10 had again moved forward with new features: retractable landing gear, enclosed crew positions, and an internal bomb bay. They were never used in anger, but they did see use in disaster relief efforts by being able to drop supplies to difficult to reach areas. Partly in an effort to show a need for a bomber force, as well as to avoid another argument with the Navy, the Army requested a design that could carry a ton of bombs for a range of 5,000 miles. The idea being that they would be able to attack enemy countries rather than their fleets. Boeing won a contract and would build for its day the enormous XB-15. It wouldn't be finished until 1937, but in this new design the B-17 was starting to take shape. The lessons learned from this testbed would go on in other long-range projects, initially with Pan Am flying boats. In 1934 a design request was submitted by the Army to replace the current B-10. They were looking for an aircraft that could carry twice as much in bomb load and almost double the range of what the B-10 was capable of. Boeing, with the XB-15 already developed, was in a good position to utilise that research, but they had a cash flow problem, and the design and prototype had to be created at the manufacturer's expense. They knew that they could reduce the scale of the XB-15 in some areas, especially the wing. They also looked at their other aircraft to see what design ideas they could pull from them. One of those planes was the 247. They secured investment and proceeded to build the prototype. The 299 was completed in 1935 and the B-17 was born. It was an extremely advanced bomber for the day and was a streamlined design. Added to that, it made the trip to the competition site in a time that none of the current fighters could match. The other aircraft in the competition were in some ways upscaled versions of their existing aircraft, and while not bad, they were not on the same playing field as the 299 was. The 299 was renamed the B-17 during the competition and it was doing extremely well. Then it crashed. A mistake had been made and the control surfaces had not been unlocked. There was one fatality and the aircraft was lost. There was not a second one available, and the competition went to the B-18 instead. The Air Corps wanted the B-17 despite the B-18 winning the competition. They were able to get enough funding for 13 B-17s and this kept the project alive. These 13 would be very different from the 299. They were a ton heavier to start with, came with a lot of modifications from the initial design, and was 7 feet longer than its predecessor. Possibly to remind the Navy that they were still there as well as to prove a point, a flight of B-17s intercepted an Italian cruise ship some 800 miles offshore. The Navy, thinking these sort of shenanigans were a thing of the past, were furious again. This caused orders that the bombers would not be able to operate outside of 100 miles of the mainland. This meant that the Air Corps' most viable targets would be Canada, Mexico, and the US mainland itself. This action did prove again a very important point, but the outcome was General Andrews would be dismissed. Perhaps its greatest success was upon one of the crew members who took part in the interception, a man who would be directly connected to the future of the US Bomber Force, Curtis LeMay. The B-17 was still being developed and the B model was released. One of the more important changes was the engines would now have superchargers. The British would be the first to use the aircraft, and while it was very impressive, there were some complaints from the crews, namely that the lack of a tail turret was something the Luftwaffe could take advantage of. The B-17 had a large change to the tail and then included a tail turret. The side armament stations were also changed. When people think of B-17s, it's often the G model, but the E is the first which incorporates most of the design changes that people think of. War came to American soil on December 7, 1941, and the call for aircraft like the B-17 became much stronger. With a lot of the men getting drafted or volunteering into the war, there was a shortfall in the workforce. Begrudgingly, they turned to women to fill the void. These women would go on to show that they were extremely good at their jobs, and while Rosie the Riveter was good PR, the war effort would not have been possible without their involvement. Although the B-17 was a very large plane, it had a lot of awkward to reach and fit in areas. This would lead to people with dwarfism finding work on the planes, crawling through the interiors in some of the most difficult to reach parts of the plane, and they did an excellent job at this. The B-17 Flying Fortress was armed with a large amount of machine guns for defence, and early on there was a belief that the bombers would not need fighter escorts and instead could adequately defend themselves. During the Battle of Britain and early RAF missions into Europe proved that this idea was broken, but it still seemed to persist at the start of the US bombing offensive. Bomb load and range had been of paramount importance. This the B-17 had, and it could reach far into enemy territory, but so focused had the army been on that idea that no focus had been placed on developing long-range escort fighters. As the daylight bomber offensive continued, it was soon clear that the Luftwaffe owned the sky. Bomber losses were mounting, and a couple of missions were disastrous. The Schweinfurt raid ended in the loss of 60 B-17s and 600 crew. The B-17 was a very tough aircraft, and many would return with dead or wounded crewmen in a condition that defied belief that it could still fly, let alone return to England to crash. Curtis LeMay tried to change the tactics his B-17s used. Firstly, he tightened the box formations. This let the gunners put out a more concentrated fire at enemy attacking fighters. This proved to be somewhat effective, though they only carried enough ammunition for around 1 minute of firing. The problem came when they encountered the enemy flak. The flak was often described as unpleasant and was at times surprisingly accurate. When the B-17s were in tighter formations, this made it easier for the German flak units to get the shells into the area around the bombers. The Luftwaffe were doing attacks from the front. There was a lot of important items towards the front of the plane, and if they could hit any of the engines or crew, it could be devastating. To try and protect the bombers, a frontal turret was added. It worked and would be fitted to the G model as standard. What was needed though was an escort fighter. The Spitfires would take them part way, but never had the range to really be effective. They found more use in patrolling for the bombers on their return leg and often escorted damaged bombers back to England. The first real escort fighter was the P-47 Thunderbolt, but even this excellent fighter could not go with the bombers for their entire mission. The B-17s would have to wait until the excellent P-51 Mustang would enter the war before they would be able to be escorted for the full length of their missions. In the Pacific, there wasn't any real deficiency on the plane as much as the distances required became ever increasing, and the B-24 was better suited to Pacific campaigns. In the end, the B-17's contribution to the war in Europe was outstanding. The crews and planes did the job that was asked of them even though they suffered high losses. They helped to bring the war to a close sooner than it would otherwise have been. Meng is one of my favourite model companies. Though Airfix still holds the #1 spot for me with their choices of crew and up and down landing gear, Meng kits have been excellent to build, and every one I have done was a lot of fun. I really liked their snap-together P-51, which was a blast to build. Now obviously these deformed tanks and planes are not in the same category as their full-scaled 135 tanks, so they have to be considered a little differently. Firstly, these are clearly meant to be easy builds and aimed at younger audiences. There will not be the detail, part count, or accuracy. The one area modelling did so well in the 1970s and 80s, and seems to struggle with today, is not just how to appeal to the youths of today in a digital age, but also what kits to offer them. These deformed kits are excellent entry-level ones and great fun, but they are not realistic. And at some point, if we can keep them interested, we need cool, easy-to-build subjects that they can do a good job on, and they can keep doing it until they get better, and then they can start to choose from anything. If this hobby is going to survive, it needs to have as many kids in it as it does old men. Honestly, the detail on this B-17 is not bad. The panel lines are not very deep, Yet there are enough of them to show off some detail and design when looking at them. The overall shape is very much a B-17. Could the guns have been more detailed? Yes. Would it be awesome if the damn thing came with a stand? Yes. Have to love old Matchbox kits there. But it's all good-natured fun. For the advanced builders, this is a weekend build, a chance to model and detox your brain away from that hard-to-build beastie you have been working on. For the beginner, this is a fun place to start which doesn't take itself too seriously, so neither should you. The build. Normally, with something like a B-17, you would start with a super complex cockpit. Every dial, gauge, and box being represented and resented at the same time. You can spend your entire adult life stuck in a 4-engine bomber's cockpit and never finish a kit before you die. There are whole wings of mental institutions devoted to trying to help modelers who have lost their minds trying to find the correct shade of interior olive drab that you won't see once you close everything up. Well, this has no cockpit at all. Who needs that crap? So I started with the bombs, which went together pretty well and fitted onto the back side of the bomb bay really well. The tail guns and side guns are super basic. The designs are all about giving the impression and not about realism. I'm cool with that, and on something like this, it's a fun cartoon build. Now the first real test is coming, and that is with the glass. But before that, I decided to build like Bandai. Now this might not work so well, so we'll see. I ended up painting all of the parts separately before building. On a 72 or 48, I wouldn't do this, as I am sure that there would be seams to deal with. There could be here as well, but this kit is just fun, so as long as the seam isn't a gap, I'm fine with that. I went with Tamiya Dark Green, Army Painter Grey and Red. The decals came from Aeromaster P38 set. Overall, the fit is pretty good, but I found, unlike Bandai, which is pretty spectacular, that here it fits well, but you have to be pretty precise with it, especially lining up the fuselage with the bottom wing. But once that is lined up, it goes together. The fuselage halves go together really well, and the glass into the cockpit frames is a good idea on how to avoid masking. The wings were the easiest part of the build. I glued the tail guns as they were the only ones that wanted to keep coming out. The last 3 items were the landing gear, and the beast is done. I don't enjoy the wheels on anything. They're just annoying for me to work on, and I am happy that they are last. But now that it's done, it was a great fun build, well worth the effort, well worth the time.